Hi, I'm Paul Young, a partner in the firm of Young, Marr, Mallis Associates. Welcome to the Paul Squared podcast. I've been helping clients file for bankruptcy relief and Social Security claims since 1986. I created this podcast to provide an overview of the bankruptcy and Social Security disability process and hopefully answer the most frequently asked questions. My goal is to help clients regain financial stability and support them through the challenging times of either being unable to work or pay their bills due to a disability. While this podcast serves to provide some general guidelines around the practice areas we discuss, you should always consult directly with an attorney to make sure the specifics of your particular situation match up with the various laws within those areas. The decision of choosing an attorney is an important one, and you should give it careful thought before deciding. If you need representation or just have any questions, please feel free to contact me at 215 639 5297 or visit our website at www.youngmarlaw.com. That's YOUNGMARRLAW.com. That's youngmarlaw.com.
All
Thank
right,
you.
everyone, welcome to episode 1 of the Paul Squared podcast. We're excited to bring this podcast to you where Paul Young and Paul Mallis are going to be able to bring their experiences, their expertise, their understanding of various practice areas to your benefit. Today, in episode 1, we're going to be starting with Paul Young. And Paul Young and I have had a chance to get to know each other pretty well over the years. And as Paul mentioned in his intro to the episode or the podcast overall, the decision in choosing an attorney is an important one, and it's something you can't take lightly. And so in episode 1, what we're going to discuss or go through is talk about Paul's background and give a little more of an understanding of who Paul Young is, the person. I think that's very important in making sure that you've chosen the right person that would be representing you the way you would want to represent yourself. So excited to introduce the podcast episode, the podcast season, and Paul Young. So Paul Young, welcome.
Well, thank you, Pete. It's nice to be here. Always great to talk to you. Thank you.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so, Paul, I thought that this would be a great chance for people to get to know a little bit more about who you are, rather than getting into the intricacies of law and the practice areas and things like that, that maybe you will be talking about in future episodes. This is a chance for people to say, oh, who is Paul Young? So starting with that, can you give us a little bit of your background? I know you're a Philly guy through and through. Have you
Sure.
always lived in Philadelphia?
Yeah, I'm Pete, as you know, I'm born and raised in Philadelphia. So I am from Philadelphia. My roots are Philadelphia. My roots have been in this area for over my whole lifetime, and I've practiced law since 1986 in Philadelphia. So I like to think that kind of makes up a little bit of what we do, what I do, and what I've looked for in representing people as well. I think there's a certain feel to knowing the people, knowing the area. And I'd like to think that that helps people be able to relate to what I do, what we do as a firm.
And you're currently, your office and where you live is the Bensalem, Bucks County area, correct?
Yes, that's for people who are familiar. I'm right outside of Philadelphia, and I live in that area as well. I've lived in this particular area for, God, my daughter's 34 years old, so 30 years plus. And it's a blue collar area, but it represents a wide variety of people, and that's what we do as a firm as well. And you get to know your clients, and you get to know the people, and I think it does help living in the area, being in the area so long, knowing the likes, dislikes. Um,
Well,
some of the
you're dealing with people's lives,
Yes,
and so understanding what that means is, often can be particular to where someone grows up, where they
yeah.
live, where
I
they
mean,
hang their hat.
and I take it very seriously from a standpoint of I realize I try to take a step back and realize we're all one step away from whether it's being doing with disability work, dealing with bankruptcy work. It could be any of us, and I like to think that I've been doing this a long time, and that helps keep me humble is understanding that it's when people are coming to meet with me, it's an unfortunate time a lot of times in their life, but it usually hopefully helps propel them into a better situation. That's the way I look at it.
And so you live in the Ben Salem area now. Is that where you grew up, or did you grow up in a different portion of
Well,
that area?
I actually grew up in Philadelphia. I grew
Okay.
up in an area, right? It's called Mayfair or Oxford Circle, right on the border, which was in Philadelphia. Both my parents were from Philadelphia. For purposes of background, I'm the first person. I was one of two children. I was the first person in my family to even go to college. I was the one that they placed that kind of role on, that I was going to further my education. My sister was in a totally different field. She was an entertainer,
Is that
and
right? What type
yeah,
of entertaining
she
did?
she my sister was a singer-songwriter, so I was
Oh,
around
wow.
music my whole life. As Pete knows, and to introduce to people who are listening, sports is my first love. So I played sports and I enjoy sports, but music is my second. So I grew up around both. And probably in that mix has to also be dogs. I'm a dog lover, and so that's a little bit about me personally. So and I find that a lot of clients, to help relax them, we first engage in conversation about their lives, and I genuinely do find it interesting how many people you can relate to, and you can put people more at ease, and I think that's an important part of choosing an attorney too. They feel comfortable with you.
Well, for sure. And so your blue collar background is legitimate.
Yes.
You've came from, where did you go to high school?
I went to Northeast High School, which again was a large high school within Philadelphia, and I came from a row home background. Where everyone knew each other. My next door neighbor knew if I came home late,
Right.
um, so they were familiar with you, and you had the same people living in the same areas for so many years. So that's part. I think that's part of the fiber. I'm a person of ritual. So, and I think that was kind of where I grew up and what I was used to, and I think my clients as well. I do feel like there's an element of they feel like they can relate to me, and I hope they can.
And so you graduate from high school out in the Philadelphia area. And as you just mentioned, you're the first one in your family to go to college. Number one, where did you go to college, and what kind of propelled you to take that path to start with?
Sure, I it's a more complicated question about both, but I went to college. I ended up graduating from LaSalle in
Okay.
Philadelphia. I went to Penn State originally, and then I transferred because of various circumstances, unfortunately, which kind of relates to how I got first involved in the disability process. My dad became disabled, and he was applying for disability. Then my dad passed, unfortunately, while I was in college, which I then came back home to Philadelphia. So that's kind of how my college background went. So I ended up staying in the area in college, and actually in law school as well.
And it sounds like your experience, or your dad's experience with whatever injury or disability he suffered, pushed you towards the direction that maybe you ultimately took in having a compassion and understanding of people who were suffering similar
Yeah,
situations.
yeah, that absolutely. That was my first exposure to disability, the disability laws, the disability flaws in the system. My dad was he was applying for disability due to a cardiac issue. He stopped working. He was only in his early 50s. I came from a household where my dad was really the only breadwinner. So because of that, it really did cause a strain. And I saw that growing up, and I did see also the exposure of it first exposed me to the disability practice. So when I became an attorney, it was natural for me to kind of have some natural interest in disability work and also bankruptcy work from it.
Well, and I think that's an important piece, and I'm sure it's part of what shaped you to the person and the lawyer that you are, is that your own personal experiences and understanding what it means for somebody to go through that is oftentimes lost, I think, in the the sterile setting of a courtroom or a law practice where people don't really understand what it means or how impactful some event like that can be in their lives. And it sounds like that was sort of maybe the starting point of your career of saying, hey, there's got to be a better way of doing this.
Looking back, I think it absolutely was. I remember the strain. I mean, you can imagine in a household where money was tight. My dad was also physically having difficulties. It just caused it. And I remember at that point, I was just starting college still. So you're young, but you
Yeah.
still that recognize that it's an area that I thought as I went through the law school and started my career, I thought it would be an interesting area to go into from a standpoint of having an impact on people's lives. That was one of my goals, really, graduating law school was and practicing was I wanted to be in an area where I would make a difference, where I wouldn't go to work and just come home.
Right.
That I would that I'd live it. So both Social Security and bankruptcy it represented that to me.
And so you go to college in LaSalle or at LaSalle, and unfortunately your dad passes away. At that point, had you already been thinking about going to law school? I know maybe that like we discussed that experience of his disability made you start thinking about that. Did you kind of know that law school was in your future at that point?
Yeah, I did. Somewhere along the way, I thought law school would be, or being a lawyer would be an appropriate profession. I either for me, knowing my inherent personality and what I felt like I'd want to do with my life. I also considered, I mean, there was a time I considered either law school or becoming a college professor. So I actually enjoyed that element as well. And I was actually considering one or the other, and probably from a pragmatic standpoint, law school seemed like the better choice for me.
And so you graduate LaSalle. Where did you end up going to law school?
I ended up going to it was at the beginning, it was called Delaware. It became Widener
Okay.
University Law School, and I graduated from there. I lived actually at that point, I moved for a brief time. I lived in Wilmington, Delaware, and that's where I also got married, and at that time, and started my career and my family, but in Delaware, and then came back to this area.
Okay. So you started in Delaware. So are you licensed in Delaware as
No,
well?
I'm actually not. I actually was in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, but I was actually commuting and living in Wilmington. But I'm actually licensed in both Pennsylvania and New Jersey. So we practice in both areas.
Got it. And so you go to law school. You mentioned you got married. Was this during law school, after law
Yeah,
school, or?
I actually got married in law school, during
Oh,
law, not in law school, but during law
right.
school. Yeah, I got married in my second year of law school, and my daughter was born actually a number of years after. But we were married. So my wife was working at that time. I was in school, and it seems like a million years ago. And it was a number. It was a million years ago. It was 40 years ago. So
Yeah.
it was a number of years ago. But that's where everything started.
You sure took a lot on in a short time frame there.
Yes, yes. Yeah, looking back, you wonder how you did it. But yeah, I did.
So you graduate law school at Widener. You're living in Wilmington area, commuting into Philadelphia. Where did you start your career? What was your first job
Well,
out of law school?
during law school, I actually worked at the Social Security Administration. So
Okay.
that was actually my first actually formal introduction into the disability process. I was writing appellate briefs for the administration. So I had that background to begin with when I graduated. Then when I graduated, I went into right away into private practice with a friend of mine from law school, and we shared space with an existing firm who was providing us different areas of practice, and that's how I actually got my first exposure to bankruptcy. They
Okay.
weren't doing bankruptcy work. There were people that they had clients, and we were fresh out of law school. We were learning, and they referred them to us and So that was my first exposure. It was myself and a former partner who I'm still close friends with, who is still practicing as well in a different area.
So besides the short stint of at the Social Security Administration's office, where you're getting more in depth with the disability process, you essentially have been a practitioner of your own law firm almost from the beginning.
Yes, yes. In
Okay.
fact, since I passed the bar in '86, and that's when we started practice. Right at the end of '86, myself and someone else, Gary Thompson, and then we at the beginning where we like every business, you're doing whatever walks in the door, and then I started to gravitate personally towards bankruptcy and disability work, and that's kind of how my career began and kind of how it unfolded.
So bankruptcy and disability have been in your legal DNA from the beginning. Do you personally practice in other areas? When in your day to day routine at your law firm.
Occasionally, I have over the years. I've done some other. I certainly have done some wills and estates. I've done some personal injury work, but at this point, I personally do about probably 95% bankruptcy and disability work. The other 5% that I personally do are things that maybe an existing client has a need for, but they and our firm, there's 5 attorneys. So there's other attorneys that do some other things as well.
Yeah, and criminal is an
Uh,
defense. Criminal defense is another big portion of the firm. That's not something that you typically get involved in, correct?
yes, that's correct. I don't do it at all, but as a firm, it makes up a large part of our practice. It evolved. When I first started practicing, it wasn't an area that I did at all. I have no exposure really to it. And it just kind of evolved from people that started working with me over years, and now it represents a big portion of what we do.
And in fact, the Paul Squared name of the podcast is because there's two Pauls, yourself and a Paul Mallis. And Paul Mallis works in the criminal side of your practice, and we'll be discussing that area of the firm in later episodes. But again, I think you just mentioned 95% of your time is focused on bankruptcy and disability.
Yes, and Paul, but almost exclusively at this point, does criminal work, and that's part of what a large part of what our firm and some other attorneys at our firm as well do.
Okay.
But I'm the wrong person for anyone to have any criminal questions with, criminal defense questions. I'm going to provide. You don't want me to provide any answer in that regard.
Well, good for you. We're not going to ask you any of
No.
those questions. So, and because episode 1 is really an introduction of Paul Young and who you are as a person, and obviously, part of that who you are is what you do and how it ties into things we're going to be discussing later. But so your path seems to be that kind of from the get-go, disability and bankruptcy were your forte, and it sounds like after 30 plus years, you've really honed in on those two areas and understand those two practice areas very well. Do you find from your experience that there are certain traits in attorneys who do what you do that are important for being able to handle those kind of practice areas? Because I know in my experience in dealing with various attorneys that it's hard to just dabble in something part-time. And I would imagine that there's, like most practice areas, there's intricacies that are involved that you get from years of doing it that become important. Could you talk about that a little bit, just in
Sure.
terms of what traits you see are important for an attorney
Yeah.
in this practice area?
I think both those areas, and I think when you're talking about both, excuse me, Social Security disability or long-term disability and bankruptcy, you're in a situation where there has to be a level of caring and compassion, because you have to put yourself you're dealing with people when they're really in distress. I mean, if you think about it, I'm meeting with someone who might be losing their home on Tuesday, and I'm trying to file a bankruptcy to save their home. There has to be a relatability. That's one thing. And that's the same with disability. You're talking to someone where you're asking them to go through a process where they might not have any income for a year, year and a half. So you have to be able to put yourself in those shoes. And I've had various attorneys who have worked with me over the years who I don't think are really cut out for that because I just don't think that they're comfortable. They can't relate, and that's definitely an element to it. The other
Well,
thing is,
compassion and empathy, those aren't things you can necessarily teach
no, you
somebody.
can't teach it, and it's something that I've had. And the other thing with bankruptcy, per se, you're talking about actually traits. I think it is a numbers thing as well. You're dealing with numbers, you're dealing with planning. There's an element almost like a financial planner might have. You need someone who has a certain amount of ability to deal with numbers, to kind of strategize what's going to work, what's not going to work. So that's more of from a technical standpoint, what an attorney might need. I do think personality wise, though, I can almost tell over the years of being in practice, when I've had a number of different attorneys who've worked with me, gone on to different things, which ones were and weren't cut out for the practice.
Yeah, and I think, particularly as you mentioned in those two practice areas in particular, this could be the low point of people's lives, whether it's
Uh,
them, a loved one, they're struggling with health and paying bills and the stress and the phone calls coming in from creditors or whatever it might be. That's a really tough spot in someone's life. And I would imagine that going through the mathematical equation of saying whether someone qualifies for bankruptcy and what's the best way to do it, or are you going to get X dollars into disability, is only part of the equation. People have to feel like they're on a path to being made whole again, or at least as whole as they can be.
Absolutely, and they can tell when you're real. I mean, that's the one
Yeah,
thing I've learned about dealing with people for the number of years I have. They can tell if you're genuine, and they can
right.
tell if you really do care, and they can. And people, I don't care what their background, what their education level, they can spot it. And if it's real, they can tell, and if it's not real, they can tell. And I've had clients say to me, "Hey, this person, I'm not happy with this particular attorney over the years," or because they can tell when it's lip service. And I think
Yeah.
that's I really enjoy what I do, and I think people can, and I know Paul, who you're going to be speaking with, with what his area he does. I think people can sense that. I think they really can, and I think that's an important part of being an effective attorney as well. I think, yeah, and for the good, bad, and the ugly of our business is if you're going to be effective at what you're going to do, you're not going to turn it off at 5 o'clock or 5:30. Unfortunately, or fortunately, you're going to be thinking about that client at 7 o'clock at night, or 8 o'clock at night, or 6 in the morning.
Yeah, and again, this is a situation that hopefully most people don't experience often in their lives. The systems, the design of how to get through these things are complicated, so it's not something that I think most people can navigate easily on their own. And they're asking someone to stand in their shoes and take care of this like they would. That's a big decision to make. And you mentioned early again that the decision to hire an attorney is an important one, but the decision of who you hire is just as important. And going to someone's website and seeing they have X number of years, you need to make sure they have the bona fides and the credentials to handle what you're asking them to do. But in these two areas in particular, it sounds like somebody who actually cares enough to learn about your situation and covering this and providing what level of comfort you can is as important as your technical expertise.
Absolutely. I mean, you have to feel very, very in the particular areas that we're discussing. I think you have to, because there's a lot of interaction.
Right,
Unlike, say, when somebody has a surgery, and the surgeon they meet with a few times and does the surgery and it's effective and you're done.
right.
When you're talking about bankruptcy and disability, it's a process, and it's usually something that takes some time, and you're having a lot of interaction with the person. And I think absolutely, whether it's myself or someone else who's handling a matter for someone in these areas, the person has to feel comfortable. If there isn't that comfort level, it's not going to work.
Well, and they got to share a lot of might be embarrassing things with you, certainly uncomfortable things. That's part of fixing the problems or finding a path forward. Is that they need to be completely honest with you as their representative to make sure that you're doing what you can for them. And if you're not comfortable with the person who you're talking about, that's difficult to communicate in the way that you need
It,
to.
you're exactly right, especially when you're taught, for example, with bankruptcy. I would say it's a large part being a counselor. I mean, it's people
Right.
unloading as to how they got into this situation. Most people, it's health or a job loss, but some people it's something as confidential as maybe an addiction issue, be
Right.
it drugs or gambling, and they want to feel like you're not judging them, that you're relating to what they're going through, and you're going to help them through it. And sometimes that's the same thing with Social Security. You're dealing with people with all different issues. Sometimes it's mental health. Sometimes you're right. Sometimes it's something where they feel not that they need to, but there's a level of embarrassment. They can't believe they're meeting with me. They can't believe they're part of this process. And it's
Right.
part of my job to hopefully get them to a point that they don't feel as uncomfortable. I feel like that's a big part of it.
Yeah, and you mentioned something I think that is interesting, that you have lawyers, you have attorneys, but it used to be that we were called counselors, and that's an important distinction. I think it's changed a lot. That nowadays most attorneys are very focused and sort of become laser focused in certain practice areas, and you have to because it's become so technical. And but back in the day, it used to be you had a problem, you went and talked to counselor at law who was there to counsel you. What should I be doing with this situation? Maybe it's not something they specialize in or not, but they're talking through the sort of logics of how to address problems. And I think that is maybe a lost art form in a lot of different law practices where that counselor doesn't necessarily exist. They're immediately going to, well, what check mark boxes can I mark off? What forms can I file, without making sure that they're covering the human element of any lawsuit or filing that has to happen.
I
That's important.
I agree, Pete. I think one of the things I try to teach young attorneys that have worked with me is it's easy to just get the information. It's more important to listen to the
Right.
people and really assess what they need. And sometimes what they need is 20 minutes of, as you said, counseling,
Yeah.
of really letting them know that it's going to be okay. I mean, for example, I just spoke with an older woman and her son, who have a sheriff's sale with foreclosure action, and the first 15 or 20 minutes was spent with reassuring her, "You're not going to lose your home. You're not going to lose your home." And
Right.
it wasn't me just telling her, "Here's what we're going to do."
Right.
It was assuring her that it's okay.
Right.
And there's an element to that that you have to be able to assess who you're dealing with and provide them the proper guidance and counseling.
Yeah.
I think that is a lost
She
art.
Yeah, she needs to know she's not going to be homeless the next day. That's
Yes.
a more
Yes.
concerning fact for her than anything else.
And Pete, honestly, that is one of the areas when it comes to practicing bankruptcy that I do enjoy, that I still get after close to 40 years, I still get satisfaction when I'm talking to someone and I'm reassuring them that through this process, you're not going to lose your home. You're going to your life is going to go on, because there a lot of times they are in genuine panic, and it really is a gratifying feeling.
And you jumped on my next question, which was what I was going to ask you, what you find most fulfilling about what you do, but it sounds like that's it. The actual ability to help people with real problems.
Really, sincerely, sometimes you get overwhelmed in any law practice, in any type of job, I'm sure, or profession. And I take a step back and then I say, boy, this, what I really do enjoy and why I keep doing it is I enjoy whether a disability, somebody's successful, now they feel so much better about their future, or
Yeah.
a bankruptcy where I just stopped the foreclosure, they're going on, they see a path to maybe have a life again, a financial life. And that is it's very gratifying. And I don't know that every area of law provides that. In fact, I think some don't. Some are just financial.
Right.
If you're doing business transactions, you're not making that kind of difference in an everyday life of someone.
Well, and I think the experiences you had early on with your dad, with where you grew up, with the background of your family and everything like that. This is it's coming full circle. That again provides an empathy and a compassion and an understanding and appreciation that may not be there otherwise, unless those were your own life's experiences.
Well, Pete, I think, yeah, I really believe a large part of what makes someone successful in this type of practice is what you just described, your own life experiences that you can empathize. I mean, everybody, I guess, to some degree has had different things happen in their life where it would, but I think if the more you've lived, help make you who you are, and I think that helps make you a more well-rounded attorney for this type of work.
Yeah, you're given the unique position where you can actually do something to help people through some of their personal
Yes,
tragedies, and that's a gift to be given to a professional to be able to use it properly.
I agree.
Well, you mentioned as an example the older lady and her son who you helped make sure their house wasn't foreclosed upon as an example of something that's recently happened. Just without naming names, obviously,
Sure.
could you give an example of somebody in a disability
Oh,
arena where
sure.
you had a similar impact?
Yes. Just as a recent case, I just represented a young man who has some mental health issues, some significant mental health. He's a very young gentleman. It's not, and people who are familiar with the process know that it's not necessarily easy for a younger person to get disability. There's certain challenges. And I was working with his parents, and they're obviously very concerned as parents. And that's what sometimes you're doing it for the individual, but a lot of times you're doing it for the whole family unit. And
Right.
that really does bring a level of gratification in and of itself with disability work. You're really helping not only the person, you're helping their spouse in some cases, you're helping their parents, and they appreciate it. And it's not only, by the way, I don't want to sound, it's not only myself, obviously, it's my staff. They're there for them. They help answer their questions. They help with the concerns they have. That's what I think is a little bit different about the work I do. It's people I'm interacting with sometimes for years. It
Right.
isn't that they're meeting with me and they have a consult and I do something for them. It's something where, especially when we'll get more into I know the different practice areas, but a Chapter 13 bankruptcy where it could be 5 years, could be more if they ended up having to do this more than once, or in a disability where it could be going on 2 or 3 years. They've been dealing with me regularly. They've been dealing with my office regularly. I know them. I know so when you have that type of situation, you really do feel like you know the people on a different level. They know me. They know
Yeah.
my interests.
Oh, yeah.
They
Well, and to your point, your example that you gave, I can imagine being in a parent's shoes where you're worried about, hey, someday they're not going to be here to take care of this child, adult or otherwise, and for them to have some comfort of saying, at least on a financial level, we know they're going to have some ability to take care of themselves. That's huge.
Yes.
And how many opportunities do people have in their lives to provide that kind of gift, if you will, to a family unit where that's their major concern?
No, you're right. I think you're right. When you look at it from that standpoint, we're fortunate from a standpoint of being able to help in that way. And we I think anyone who's a parent, and especially if you do have any children or as Pete, you might know, I have a daughter has certain needs, special needs, and so you can relate. And I think
Yeah.
again that comes down to people can sense that you can relate, and people can sense that you care, and you get gratification. You're not only happy for them, you're just generally you get gratification knowing you're part of the process that helped them get to meet a goal, which was maybe in this case have a child who has at least some financial security that he didn't have.
So, Paul, I think you just mentioned a minute ago that you have a special needs daughter.
Yes, I do.
And again, I think all these things that aren't, you don't have a completely clean, easy life of, everything's gone perfect for you over the span of it. That shapes you for who you are, that allows you to put yourself in somebody else's shoes, maybe easier than some other people who haven't experienced all that.
I think so, Pete, and also what I try to even express to certain attorneys when they've worked with me is, yeah, you have to let people know a little bit about. You have to show that underbelly of your own, so that people can relate and people know you can relate. And I think that is what helps you gain the trust and
Right.
helps you be a better, as you mentioned, counselor, right?
Right.
And not only advocate, but counselor. And I think
Yeah.
it's important. And I think there's too many attorneys who don't want to do that. And to me, that's a flaw within our profession.
Well, for sure, for sure, and I think that that's again something that distinguishes you, whether they're all of your own making or not. It is what's caused you to become the counselor, the attorney that you are,
Well,
with the backgrounds of what you've experienced, and
yeah,
that's a unique set.
yeah. Well, and unfortunately, like you said, I mean, we've all, I mean, experienced whether it be death or whether you have a child with, and if that doesn't make you better at what you're doing, then I think you're not applying your life's experiences properly.
Right, right. One of the questions I had for you is that at this point, could you ballpark how many bankruptcy cases you've handled,
Wow,
how many disability cases
sure.
you've handled?
Um, from a bankruptcy perspective, I would say I've probably handled well over 10,000,
Okay.
which is quite a number, probably more. Um, between 10 and 15,000, I think is a fair estimate. Probably a disability, I've probably handled close to 5,000 claims.
Wow.
So a lot
So
of claims.
you've probably seen it at this point. If I'm guessing you're
Um,
not overly surprised by anything someone brings you at this point.
I feel old when you ask me that question, Pete, with the number of claims. Um, no, there really isn't. I mean, when it's very interesting because I think we're all guilty of this. When we have certain issues, we think we're alone, and
Right.
we think our situation's unique. And I try to tell people when they're meeting with me that, well, it feels like it. You'd be surprised how many people are in your situation. I think that's
Yeah.
true. I think
Yeah,
that,
it's got to be comforting for people to, number one, say it out loud, make it real, but then also realize that they aren't the first people who have crossed your threshold with the same
yes.
type of problems.
Yes, and you're right, though. It's very rare at this point that I meet with someone, be it disability, be it bankruptcy, where I haven't seen something of at least a similar ilk before, even though they feel like I probably am the only one that's ever presented this fact pattern to you.
Right, right. And now, Paul, I have been fortunate enough to see some pictures of your younger self with quite a impressive
Oh,
hairdo on top.
oh,
So Paul
oh,
Young of today gets the chance to
oh,
talk to Paul Young of
oh, God.
18 years old with
Oh, God.
this voluminous
Oh, God.
70s hair that was going on, I believe.
Oh,
Is there any
yeah.
advice you'd give to your younger self? Would you do anything different? Is there anything that you would
Boy.
say, hey, this is something you need to be thinking about?
Well, I think in hindsight, everybody would say, and this isn't probably just me, you appreciate number one when you're 18 years old, appreciate your youth, appreciate how your life is relatively carefree compared to as you get older. If I had to, there's not much I would do differently, except sure you'd love to have certain wisdom that you have at 63 that you didn't have at 18. But I would say from a career path standpoint, I'm pretty happy about the way the path I took. Although certainly I would have made some changes like most people, but I can't think of one thing in particular that I would have. I think the one thing probably would have been looking back. I think you have to recognize that to every, there's always consequences to whatever action. And I probably would have taken schooling and some other things a little more seriously at 18 than I did. But I think probably that's typical of a lot of people looking back that, I would have, I think the other thing on a more serious note is you learn to appreciate your loved ones because you should recognize they're not always going to be with you. I was only 18 when my dad passed away. So I wish, I would have, you don't think at that age you're going to, and then later on when my wife passed away,
Yeah.
you wish you appreciated that's a reality. And
Yeah.
so I would have probably done things a little differently in that regard.
Well, I'll leave you with one last thing before
Sure.
we end episode 1. On a lighter note, rank your Philadelphia teams from top to lowest in terms of your fandom.
Yeah, but as Pete knows, I'm a very big sports fan. I'm a very big, in general, sports fan, and certainly the Eagles are my. I'm a big football fan, so the Eagles would have to be my first love. After that, I'm probably now at this stage baseball and basketball, although but football's and then hockey and every sport you could throw in between. But Pete knows and right now I have high expectations for our Eagles. So and for
Fly,
Pete
Eagles, fly.
and Pete's in the other portion of the state, which is Pittsburgh, and obviously the Steelers are, as we speak, he's pretty optimistic. So right now is a good time to be a Philadelphia sports fan in with the football.
And we're hoping that by the time this podcast airs, that we'll be talking about a Eagles Steelers Super Bowl.
Yeah, we certainly could be.
Well, thank you, Paul. We're going to wrap up episode 1. I hope this gave everybody who's listening a good chance to understand who Paul Young is. I think that's important for our people to know who it is that they're going to be talking to, considering hiring for their needs. Again, we're going to go through episodes to talk more specifics about different practice areas and what goes into each of those. So stay tuned for episode 2, where we're going to start to get into explanation of bankruptcy law and the sort of details that go into that. But thanks for joining us for episode 1, and stay tuned for episode 2 of the Paul Squared podcast. Thank you.
Thank you, Pete.